that? Is that?
Wrong. Anybody else?
Was it like a prokaryotic bacteria?
Wrong. Anybody? Anybody? So I don't know how many of you guys remember from not the last lab, but from the first lab when we were doing the scientific method. Remember that last page that had all those questions? Remember was that one question said that had that statement, all living things are made of cells. Is this a theory or a conclusion? You remember guys remember that question from the first lab? That statement, all living things are made of cells, is what we're going to be really talking about today. Because literally every organism is made out of cells. In fact, when you're talking about yeast and bacteria, they are cells. One bacterial organism or one yeast organism is a cell. And in fact, you and me, we think of ourselves, this me, myself, as one organism, right? But I'm really not. I'm actually billions and billions of living organisms working together to make this thing that you call sand. And this is true for you guys too. Because what a cell actually is a living organism. In fact, a cell is the smallest, most simplest living organism that you can have. It's the smallest, simplest thing you can call a life form. So what we're going to be talking about today are these life forms called cells, kind of your anatomy, what parts they have, how those parts work, and how ultimately those parts add up to you and all the other living organisms that exist on this planet. All right. So that statement that we had just talked about, all living things are made of cells, is actually a theory. It's called cell theory. And cell theory is actually a very simple theory, guys. If you looked it up on Wikipedia, it literally is like a very short paragraph with a bunch of like history stuff about it. But really, it's a very short and simple theory. It basically only has two statements. One, all organisms are composed of cells. And this is going to be true for any organism, whether it's one cell is that one organism. So for example, in bacteria, one bacterial organism is one cell. Or the organism can be made out of many cells, kind of like how you guys are. So that's the first statement of cell theory. All organisms are composed of cells. Now remember, I said cells are living organisms too, right? So you guys think back to those 7 criteria for living organisms that we talked about in the very first lecture. What was one of those criteria that all living organisms have? Something that we can all do. Reproduce, right? They have cells of living organisms. Do they reproduce?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so the second statement of the cell theory leads to that. The second statement of the cell theory is all cells just come from other cells. In other words, the only way you can have new cells is if older cells reproduce to produce them. So that's the other part of it. So this kind of leads to two things here. One, that all living organisms are cells or are made up of cells, and cells themselves are indeed living organisms. Does that make sense? So that's what the all cell theory says. Like I said, if you look up the Wikipedia article, it literally is just these two statements. So it's actually, even though it's a simple or very short theory, it's really huge, right? Because it's really the foundation of all living organisms on Earth. All right. Now, besides looking, living organisms or cells are living organisms. We already established that. But they're not just living organisms. You can also look at them in a different way. You can also look at them as being factories. Cells are like little factories. And these factories, just like any other factory, they're making something. What that something is, I'll tell you later. But you can also look at every part of a cell in its anatomy as being the employees of that factory. So each part of the cell is an employee of this factory. They're working together to build something. And a cell is a factory of that something. So what does this factory look like? So here's just kind of a simple schematic of a cell, this factory we're talking about. And inside these cells, there are going to be a bunch of parts, all of which, like I said, you can think of them as the employees of this factory, all working together keep this factory working and making what it makes. So of course, every factory wants to be secure, right? It wants to protect itself. And also every factory wants to be able to bring supplies in, right? Anything that it needs to build, whatever it's building, needs to be able to bring that in. And whatever it makes, it has to be able to send it out, right? So in cells, there's a part of the cell that's really important that does that very job. There's a part of the cell that actually protects the cell and brings things in or takes things out of the cell on a regular basis. And I had mentioned it to you guys in the last lecture. It's called the cell membrane. We also sometimes call it the plasma membrane, but either term is correct. We all either call it the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Either one works. Now the cell membrane, you can think of it as kind of like the factory security. There are guys that, you guys ever driven into like a secure location? They have that guard booth, they have a barbed wire, and you have to stop at the guard booth and they check your ID and stuff like that. You can think of the cell membrane kind of like those guys. They're there to make sure that the right things come in and out and nothing else. Now, if you guys recall from the last lecture, we talked about the different organic compounds. I told you guys that that cell membrane is made out of a lipid. In fact, that lipid is called phospholipid. And remember those phospholipid molecules, they form these two layers that together are your cell membrane. And sometimes we call the cell membrane a phospholipid bilayer because of that. Because it's actually made up of two phospholipid layers combined, sandwiched together to make that cell membrane. Now it's really important that that phospholipid layer is made out of phospholipids. Because remember, you want certain things to come in and certain things to stay out, right? And one of the cool things about phospholipids is that they have the ability to control what stays in or what stays out. And part of the reason is because phospholipids have two properties in the same molecule. They're both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. So you guys remember what hydrophobic meant?
It doesn't like water.
It doesn't like water, right? Which means it doesn't dissolve in water, right? So phospholipids have one end of their molecule being hydrophobic, meaning that it won't dissolve in water. But what's unique about phospholipids is on the opposite end of the molecule, they're hydrophilic. What does that mean?
They love water.
Yeah, it loves water, which means
Dissolving.
it can dissolve in water, right? So what's really cool about phospholipid molecules is they have both of these kind of opposite properties in the same molecule. But because of that, it's able to, these phospholipids, when they're connected as a cell membrane, have the ability to control things coming in and out. And we'll talk more about how that works in chapter 5. But just remember, your cell membrane, this skin that's around every one of your cells, is made out of phospholipids. And these phospholipids have this unique property of being both water soluble and water insoluble. Any questions so far about that? So I've already shown you guys this before, so you guys remember this from the last lecture, right? This was this cross-section of cell membrane. And you remember these red and yellow things over here? Those are your phospholipid molecules. You notice there's actually two layers, right? There's one layer here, one layer here. That's why we call it phospholipid bilayer. Combined together, sandwiched together, this whole skin that they make up is the cell membrane. But you also see a bunch of other stuff, right? See these blue things here. So besides having phospholipids in your cell membrane, you also have a bunch of proteins. You guys remember about proteins from the last lecture? Why are proteins so special? Why are they so important to you?
They're involved in everything.
They're involved in everything, right? So these proteins that you see in this cell membrane, they're the ones doing various functions that the cell membrane needs to do. Bringing things in, maybe keeping things out, things like that. So these proteins are embedded in that phospholipid membrane. Some of them form channels. They form like little holes through that cell membrane. And those holes can let things come into the cell make or let things come out of the cell. Think of them like little tunnels. Some of these proteins, though, they do a little bit more. Some of these proteins, rather than just being holes that let things go through freely, some of these proteins instead act like pumps. You can actually physically grab things from outside the cell and bring them into the cell. Or the opposite. Some of these pumps can actually take things that are inside the cell and push them out of the cell. So they act like pumps. And these are just a couple of functions that those proteins can do. These proteins can do a bunch of other things as well. Some of these proteins can be important for doing things like immune responses. If something comes around, tries to attack your cells, some of those proteins that you have on your cell membrane can detect that and respond to those attacks. So there's a lot of these functions these proteins do that are embedded in your cell membrane. Again, we'll talk more about this stuff in the cell membrane and how it works in Chapter 5, which is the next lecture. But again, I just want to introduce you guys to the cell membrane, what's in it, and what it does. So any questions about the cell membrane, what it does? Cool. All right. Now, before we move any further about the other parts of the cells, we have to talk about the different types of cells that exist. Because remember, we said all living organisms on Earth are made up of cells, right? But not all living organisms are made out of the same cells. Some organisms, their cells make them what we call prokaryotes. While other organisms, their cells are different. And so we call those organisms eukaryotes. So all organisms on Earth, based on what type of cells they have, are either prokaryotes or eukaryotes. So let's start by talking about the prokaryotes, mainly because they are simpler. Prokaryotes, their cells don't quite have as many parts as the eukaryotes. There are fewer things going on. Now, the types of organisms that would be prokaryotes that have these simpler cells, they would be organisms like bacteria and archaea. So you guys are all familiar with bacteria, right? The ones that you usually think of when you get sick and stuff like that. Archaea are related organisms. Again, they're not bacteria though, but they are prokaryotes, just like the bacteria are. Now the thing about these prokaryotes, like I said, their cells are much simpler than your own. They do have a cell membrane, just like you do, but they have a lot fewer parts beyond that. So the inside of their cell is a gooey stuff called cytoplasm. It's just like a jelly-like fluid. You have it in your cells too. They also have DNA, because remember, bacteria, archaea, they are living organisms, and like we had talked about in the last lecture, living organisms have nucleic acids, right? So they will have DNA, and they store their DNA in a single chromosome. I mean, they take all their DNA and bundle it into one bundle. They also have these structures called ribosomes that produce proteins. And we'll talk more about ribosomes when we start talking about eukaryotes. But besides these parts, that's basically all they have. They have no nucleus, so they don't have anything in the middle that holds their DNA, and they don't really have any other parts. So you can see they're pretty simple, right? They really only have this is not really a part, it's just the gooey stuff inside. They really only have 1, 2, 3 structures inside their cells. Pretty simple guys. But they do have one extra thing that you guys know. They have what's called a cell wall. So they're very outside of these prokaryote cells. They'll take some protein and some carbohydrates and they'll build a shell around themselves. We call that a cell wall. That protects the cell, of course, because it's basically a shell, and also helps maintain its shape. So you can't just crush it or something like that. Besides that cell wall, prokaryotes also have other structures on the outside of their bodies, because prokaryotes, they are not like you. Your cells that make up your body, they have legs, right? You can walk around with legs, stuff like that. Prokaryotes, though, they are by themselves. Remember, one cell is one organism when it comes to these prokaryotes. So that cell has to be able to swim and crawl and whatnot through its environment. So if you look at the outside of these prokaryote cells, you'll see a whole bunch of structures that they use to do things like swim, stick to things, that sort of thing. So these prokaryotes, we'll talk more about them in a future lecture. It's not going to be for a while, but we will talk more about these prokaryotes. But I just want to introduce you guys to their existence and to how kind of their cells are structured. So that when we talk about them in the future, you guys know what we're talking about. Any questions about the prokaryotes, about how they're structured, what makes them who they are? So those are a bunch of words, and so I'm sure you guys are tired of reading words. So here's a picture. Here's a picture of a basic prokaryote. And when you look at it, there's really not that much to it. Yeah, there's a bunch of labels here, but really it's not that much, right? This is all their DNA bundled up into one cluster, so it's what we call a chromosome. These little dots are supposed to be the ribosomes, which are those structures that make protein. They have a cell or plasma membrane, which is this layer right here, and then they have the cell wall on the outside. And then to swim around, they have these little kind of projections coming out like this. In this case, they're called projections. That's pretty much it. I don't have much else to say about them. Well, like I said, we'll talk more about them in a future lecture. But for the most part, that's pretty much all the parts they have. Not much more to it. So these are prokaryotes. These are what their cells look like. As you can see, they're pretty simple. But there are other cells out there that are much more complex. So all other organisms that aren't bacteria and are not archaea are going to be eukaryotes. Okay? So if you're not bacteria, if you're not archaea, you're going to be a eukaryote. So is a cactus a eukaryote?
Yeah.
Yes, because it's not a bacteria, right? It's not ours. Is a goldfish a eukaryote?
Yeah.
Yes. Is a human a eukaryote?
Yep.
Yes, exactly. So any organism that is not bacteria, not archaea, is going to be a eukaryote. So vast majority of the organisms on the planet are going to be eukaryotes. Now, what makes eukaryotes different from prokaryotes? Well, first off, eukaryotes hold their DNA in a special chamber. If you notice back at the previous image, that DNA of the bacteria was just a bundle, right? Just floating around inside the cell. But eukaryotes don't do it that way. Instead, they keep those bundles of DNA inside a special structure called a nucleus. The other thing, too, about eukaryotes that make them different from the prokaryotes is they have a lot more parts. And those parts that allow the eukaryotes to operate are called organelles. And we'll talk about what those organelles are and what they do. So really, those are the two things that make the eukaryotes different from the prokaryotes. Eukaryotes keep their DNA in a chamber called a nucleus, and they have a lot more parts. And those parts are called organelles. And I really want to make sure that I emphasize to you guys that unless you're bacteria or archaea, you're going to be a eukaryote. Okay? So every organism that is not one of these or not one of these is going to be a eukaryote. And so these two cells, you don't have to really care too much what's labeled, but this is the animal cell, this is the plant cell, just to show you guys that both these organisms, plants and animals, even though they're very different from each other, are still eukaryotes because their cells share many of the same structures. And like I had already established, because we are animals, we are indeed also eukaryotes. Okay. So any questions about difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes? Yes.
So there's only two types of cells, and it's either eukaryote or prokaryote?
Yes, exactly. Cool. So let's move on to the eukaryotes specifically. We're done talking about prokaryotes for the next few weeks. Now we're going to talk about the eukaryotes specifically. And remember, I had said the eukaryotes have a lot more parts, and those parts are called organelles. Then you notice there's a word in organelles that you guys are probably familiar with. What word is it? Organelles. I guess you're probably familiar. Organ, right? Organ. What's an organ?
Liver.
Like a liver, right? Or a heart, right? Parts of your body that keep you alive, right? So organelles are basically organs, but they're organs of the cells. So these are parts that help the cell stay alive and survive and do its thing, which ultimately means organelles are the things that keep you alive, right? Because you are made up of cells. And so these parts that we're going to talk about, these organelles, are the parts in your body that keep you alive, just at a very microscopic level. So you guys already saw this image before earlier in the lecture. This image is specifically of a eukaryotic cell. And if you notice, it has a lot more parts than you saw in that prokaryote cell, right? Prokaryote cell didn't have any of these parts floating around inside. These eukaryote cells are much more complex because they have all these organelles. And these organelles serve important functions for that cell. Now, the first part of the cell we're going to really dive into is this part right here in the middle. This is that chamber that we talked about earlier that stores the DNA of the cell. And it's called the nucleus. So the nucleus doesn't just exist and work by itself. It works in concert with those things called ribosomes. Ribosomes are one of those structures that produce proteins. And kind of going back to that factory analogy, the nucleus and the ribosomes are pretty much like the CEO and the factory workers of this little factory that we call a cell. And the reason why is because the nucleus and the ribosomes are the ones that control your cell. They're the ones that actually take the information in your DNA and control your cell. And that's why I call the nucleus the CEO and the ribosomes the factory workers. So the first part of this kind of structure is, of course, the nucleus itself. And like I said, I call it the CEO. So what does the CEO do, guys? Besides make millions and millions of dollars.
Control everything.
Right. You know, they're the person up on top that says, like, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. The company's going in this direction. Right? They're ultimately the ones who are in charge. And so the nucleus of each one of your cells is pretty much that CEO. And the reason why it's the CEO is because it has the company's secrets. And the company's secrets are contained in the DNA. Because remember, DNA is basically a blueprint, right? It's a blueprint for you. And so if the nucleus has that blueprint, it has the ability to really determine how you look and how you function. So the nucleus, the CEO, controls the cell's activities. The way it's able to control the cell's activities is because it carries the DNA, which is organized into structures called chromosomes inside that nucleus. So the nucleus itself, like I said, is a chamber. It has an outer area, membrane, that makes that chamber a chamber. And we call that outer membrane of the nucleus the nuclear envelope. Now that nuclear envelope is just like almost like the cell membrane in a lot of ways. It regulates the entry and exit of things from the nucleus. More specifically, it controls the entry and exiting of RNA. So RNA was a nucleic acid I had mentioned in a previous lecture. I'm not going to get too much into it. We'll talk about RNA and what it does once you get to chapter 10. But just remember, RNA is really important. Your DNA can't do anything without RNA. So that's really important. The other thing about the nucleus, too, is that it's connected to another organelle in your cells. It's connected to an organelle called the endoplasmic reticulum. I'll talk about what that is in the next couple slides. And then deep inside the very middle of the nucleus is yet another structure. And it's called the nucleolus. Very creative, right? Now the nucleus is the CEO. The nucleolus is the HR department. So what's the HR department, you guys?
Hire people.
Fire and hire people, right? So in this case, the nucleolus is hiring the factory workers. It's the one that makes the ribosomes that will be doing the work of your cell factory. So that's why I call the nucleolus the HR department. And it's found inside of the nucleus as well. That makes sense? You guys like the factory analogy? Hopefully it makes things a little more sense. Any questions about the nucleus, what it does, what's inside? All right. So of course, I'm sure you guys want to see a picture because again, a bunch of words. What does that mean? So here, we'll get to that actually. Let's talk about the ribosomes. So that nucleolus, the HR department, is making these things called ribosomes. And ribosomes, like I said, are the factory workers. They're the ones who are actually doing the work that that cell factory is supposed to be doing. And what they're doing specifically is that they are making proteins. So your cells are really factories that make proteins. Because remember what we said about proteins. Every part of you is made out of proteins. Everything your body does is done with proteins. So your cells have to be able to make the right proteins all the time in order for them to function, for you to function. And so what ribosomes do is they take instructions from the DNA and they build proteins with those instructions. Now certain cells in your body will make a lot more proteins than others. And so if there are cells in your body that need to make a lot of proteins, they're going to have a lot of ribosomes. Now ribosomes, though, some of them are floating around inside your cells, kind of freely floating inside. But most of your ribosomes are attached to another organelle. They're attached to that endoplasmic reticulum that we had mentioned earlier. There's a reason why they're attached there. But remember, because these ribosomes, their responsibility is to build all the proteins your cell needs. Every part of the cell needs proteins. Every function that the cell needs to do needs proteins. So these ribosomes are really important because they're building those proteins that are necessary for the cell to live. Which means they're building the proteins that are necessary for you to live. Any questions about the ribosomes? Yeah.
To go back a little bit on the nucleus, you said that the majority of the DNA is stored inside the nucleus, is this correct? Where's the rest of it? Did I miss that?
Oh, in the case of eukaryotes like ourselves, it's all in the all the DNA
okay.
inside the nucleus. The only prokaryotes can have some DNA floating around separately from their main chromosome,
Got it.
but they don't have a nucleus, so they're not.
Okay.
But for us, yeah, all our DNA is going to be contained inside the nucleus.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the nucleolus makes the ribosomes, and the ribosomes make the proteins.
That's right. Any other questions? Right. So yeah, that's a bunch of words. I was doing a lot of words in. So here's a picture. Feel better. So here's your cell. There's the eukaryote cell. And that big thing right here, that's that nucleus, that chamber that they store their DNA in. You zoom into that, this is what it looks like. You can see it's got an outer kind of membrane. In the middle here, this big nest. This is all the DNA of the cell. And in this structure in the middle is the nucleolus, the organelle to be producing the ribosomes. You also notice that this, the nucleus has a bunch of holes in the envelope. Those holes that RNA come out of the cell, but also how ribosomes that are made in here end up out here. So these little yellow dots here are the ribosomes, those structures that make protein. And you notice they're stuck to this wiggly wobbly thing right here, right? All this stuff. So this wiggly wobbly stuff, that's that endoplasmic reticulum. This is where you're going to find most of your ribosomes in your cells, stuck to these things. So I'll visualize the nucleus, kind of what's connected to it. Yeah.
Maybe exam, are you going to have to label this?
No. Just kind of know where it is, where it's other, so we do. Awesome. So let's come back to this guy right here. So we've talked about this, right? Nucleus, the DNA inside, nucleolus inside. And then we start talking about this right here. This endoplasmic reticulum and all the ribosomes connected to it. But there's also a bunch of other organelles all over the place inside the cell and outside of this. And all of those organelles, besides the nucleus, form what's called the endomembrane system. These are all the organelles that your cells have besides the nucleus. Now this part of the cell, of course, is going to be where the majority of the organelles are going to be. And so bulk of the parts that you need to know and for this course anyway, are going to be found in this endomembrane system of your cell. So the first part of the endomembrane system, I've already mentioned to you guys. It's directly connected to the nucleus, and it's where most of your ribosomes are found. And it's called your endoplasmic reticulum. Now the reason why your ribosomes are mostly found on this endoplasmic reticulum is because this organelle is basically an assembly line. It's the factory floor. This is where the protein that your cell factory is making is made. Because your ribosomes are connected to the assembly line, this endoplasmic reticulum, in order to make those proteins. Now, endoplasmic reticulum itself, as you saw in earlier images, it just looks like a bunch of wiggly wobbly stuff, right? Really what it is a bunch of sacs and tubes that are all connected to each other, and that's where your cell ribosomes are going to be found. Now, endoplasmic reticulum is a cool term to know. If you want to sound really smart at a party, just say endoplasmic reticulum, everyone gets really smart. But also, I get tired of saying it over and over, so I'm just going to call it ER. Is everybody okay with that? Cool. All right. So the ER, there's actually two parts to the ER, and they're different based off of whether or not they have ribosomes. So one part of the ER is called a smooth ER. And it's called a smooth ER because it doesn't have ribosomes attached to it. And because it doesn't have ribosomes attached to it, it looks smooth. That's what we call that. The rough ER, the other part of this organelle, it does have ribosomes. And because it has ribosomes stuck to it, guess what it looks like? Exactly. It looks rough. That's why they call it that. I know, very creative, right? I wish all of science was this simple. It's bumpy, it's not bumpy. There. So you have two parts of the ER, smooth ER and rough ER. One lacks ribosomes, one has ribosomes. Now, here I'm going to show you kind of where the ribosome or where the ER is, and also kind of the differences between a rough and smooth ER. So remember, we got our nucleus here, and remember the ER itself is actually attached to the ribosome, to the nucleus. Now when you zoom in to the ER, this is what it looks like. This side is called a rough ER. This side is called a smooth ER. You can't really tell because unfortunately the dots are really small. But you see all these little yellow dots right here? You guys see them? Those are all ribosomes. And if you look at this image, you see most of those yellow dots are on this side of the ER, right? So this is the rough ER. This side, you do see a few dots here and there, but nowhere near as many of the ribosomes as that side. So this side is a smooth ER. Which is funny because this image doesn't really look that smooth.
Does it have more pockets? Because
I would say more like, really physically the difference is that the rough ER, besides having more ribosomes, is more like, I would say, a bunch of folds, while the smooth ER is a bunch of tubes. So if you're talking about physically their differences, how they're structured, that's kind of the difference besides the ribosome. So, good question. All right, so you have these two parts to the ER, but why do you have these two different parts? It's because the ER does two different functions depending on whether it has ribosomes or not. So the smooth ER, it does have some ribosomes, but not as many. But the ribosomes that are on a smooth ER are very important. The smooth ER, its job is to produce enzymes. You guys remember enzymes from a previous lecture, right? Enzymes are being those proteins that speed up chemical reactions. And so your smooth ER of your cells, they're responsible for making those proteins. But all the other proteins that your cell needs and cell makes is made in the rough ER. Because remember, rough ER is where most of the ribosomes are. So of course, most of the other proteins that your cell needs are going to be made in the rough ER. So all the proteins that are in the cell membrane, all the proteins that make the body parts, stuff like that, that's going to be made by the rough ER of your cells. Any questions about that? So your ER is responsible mainly for being a place where your ribosomes can make proteins. Well, once proteins are made, though, by your ribosomes, so here's the ribosome right here. Here's part of your ER, and it's made of protein. But once that protein is made, though, it doesn't just stay in the ER. That protein needs to go somewhere. It needs to go to another part of the cell, or it needs to leave the cell entirely in order for that protein to do its job. So what's going to happen is, after that protein is made, a piece of the ER is actually going to surround that protein and then come up. And that little pocket, that little bundle of protein that's been released by the ER can then be sent to where it needs to go in order to be able to do its job. Now once that protein has left the ER and it's on its way somewhere, your cell needs a way to tell it where to go. And that's what the Golgi apparatus does. So the Golgi apparatus is kind of like the shipping and receiving department of your factory. Once your factory has made its protein, it needs someone to put it in a box, stick a shipping label on it, and send it off to where it needs to go. That's what the Golgi apparatus does. What it will do is it will receive proteins that are coming from the ER, it will store them like a warehouse, and then process them, basically sending them where they need to go. Now in order to do that, it also puts the proteins into little pockets, which we call vesicles, and those vesicles can then be used to transport those proteins to wherever they need to go. Now sometimes these proteins can just be sent to another part of the cell, but also, a lot of times, these proteins can also be sent outside the cell. A lot of these proteins your cells make are going to be used elsewhere in your body. And all that sending out of proteins and figuring out where it goes is done by the Golgi apparatus. shop at Amazon. Not that I shop at Amazon. I actually have one of those Amazon credit cards so that I can like burn a bunch of points and then use it and buy more stuff on Amazon. So apparently, so you guys know about Prime Day? How Amazon has like its own like Black Friday sort of thing in the middle of the year. So they usually keep dates secret until like the last minute, but somebody like accidentally leaked it. So now we're pretty sure it's going to be July 16th. So mark your calendars. I know I will. The reason I bring up Amazon is not because I just want small account. Is because the Golgi apparatus is kind of like Amazon. Because you know how Amazon is, right? You're always receiving products from different companies, factories, and you're shipping them out all over the place, right? So I also like to call the Golgi apparatus the Amazon.com for the ER. Because the ER is constantly making things, right? But it's up to the Golgi apparatus to take those proteins from the ER and send them out where they need to go. That's why I like to call it Amazon.com. So that's the Golgi apparatus right there. You can see it's a bunch of pockets and holes, not that different from the ER. But its job is to receive proteins that came from the ER and then putting them into a new vesicle and send them off to wherever it needs to go. Questions about the Golgi apparatus? Now, every factory needs janitors. Like, things get messy, things break, sometimes you need to digest some things. That's what you need janitors for. So when you're inside your cell, the janitors are called lysosomes. So what lysosomes really are the little bags of enzymes. These little bags of enzymes called lysosomes. They're floating around inside your cells, ready to clean up whatever needs to be cleaned up. Let's say, for example, your cell, it's sitting around and it receives some food product. Oh, sweet. Got some food, we can get some energy out of this. But it needs somebody to break that food down first. So what will happen is these lysosomes will come by, attach to that piece of food, and then use the enzymes to digest that food. Or let's say something comes by and starts to attack your cells. Some bacteria come by and germs. What your cells can do is they can use those lysosomes to kill those bacteria using those enzymes that are contained inside the lysosomes. So lysosomes, I call them the janitors, but they really do a lot more than that. They're more than just a cleanup crew. Because they can actually protect your cells from attacks by things like bacteria and viruses. Now, because of course I'm getting tired of talking right now, I'm going to have on a video that will talk more about this, so I don't have to talk about it.
Lysosomes are membrane-bound vesicles that contain hydrolytic enzymes. The hydrolytic enzymes degrade proteins, nucleic acids, lipids, and carbohydrates, and are formed in the endoplasmic reticulum. These enzymes are then transported to the Golgi apparatus by transport vesicles. The lysosomes arise from the Golgi apparatus. When particles such as viruses or bacteria are ingested by phagocytosis, the lysosome fuses with the particle-containing vesicle, called a phagosome, and delivers the hydrolytic enzymes. Lysosomes also fuse with organelles such as old mitochondria. This results in the destruction and recycling of these structures.
Go lysosomes. So you can see lysosomes do quite a few things for you. Kind of break down things that are dangerous, break down foods, and also to kind of help recycle in parts of your cell that need to be recycled. And then finally, sometimes your cell needs to be able to store things. Just like a factory, right? Factories at some point, you build a bunch of stuff, you need to store it somewhere so you can sell it, right? In your cells, your storage units are called vacuoles. You can also think of them kind of like just storage bins. a place for your cells to put things. For example, any materials that have been digested by your lysosomes, any nutrients that came from that, your cells can store in these vacuoles for the time being. If your cells have excess stuff, like maybe extra water, okay, you can store it inside of that. And they kind of act like temporary stomachs. These are places where food and whatnot can be sit inside and get digested, and when the time is needed. And then also vacuoles, they carry what are called pigments. So, for example, when you look at anything that has any color to it, that color is coming from molecules called pigments. And those pigments inside living organisms are going to be stored in vacuoles. So, for example, your skin. Everybody's skin has different tones, right? And those different tones are caused by the pigments that you have in your skin. Those pigments are going to be stored in vacuoles inside your skin cells. And that's why you have certain colors of skin. So these vacuoles, these storage bins inside your cells, can serve many functions. Just to store food, water, and even the things that give color to living organisms. Now some vacuoles are special because they serve very special functions. One particular vacuole is very important you will only find in plant cells. If you look inside a plant cell, you'll see it's got a nucleus, just like you do, but it'll have this really big empty space in the middle. Now the space isn't empty. It's actually filled with water. This big vacuole filled with water that's inside most plant cells is called the central vacuole. The central vacuole is a unique feature of all plants. No other organisms on the planet have this water-filled vacuole. Now what that central vacuole does, we'll talk about that later. See that a little quicker. Now this is just an example of one of these vacuoles, one of these storage bins or storage units that cells will have inside their bodies. Alright. So we got our factory. We kind of going over some different parts of the factory that make the proteins, send out the proteins, store things, and clean things up. But every factory needs one thing, and it's not just work. What does every factory need? Energy. It needs power. Every factory needs energy in order to operate. In your cell factory here is no exception. It needs energy. It needs energy from something. And so your cells and the cells of other eukaryotes use mitochondria and perhaps chloroplasts to get that energy. They're really, these two groups of organelles are really the power generators of eukaryote cells. Without these organelles, eukaryote cells could not survive because they are literally providing all the energy necessary to keep that factory going. So the first group of these organelles I want to talk about are the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are the ones that are really generating the energy. And they do that by doing a chemical reaction called cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration we'll talk more about in chapter 6. But what you need to know right now is that cellular respiration takes the energy that you get from your food and puts that energy into a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. It does that by performing cellular respiration. And we'll talk more about cellular respiration, mitochondria, what they are, and how they work in chapter 6. But I just want you guys to kind of be introduced to the idea that mitochondria are the ones that provide energy for eukaryote cells that you run.
So one of the important things about mitochondria that you need to know, not necessarily right now, but you will definitely know this when we talk about cell respiration, are their structure. They have what's a structure that has actually two membranes. There's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And there's a reason for that. And we'll go into the reason as to why when we talk about cell respiration. Just remember that they have a certain structure that allows them to do this cell respiration. So there's a bunch of words again, but I have an image to help you guys kind of better understand what we're talking about here. We're talking about the mitochondria and their structure, particularly the outer and inner membrane. So this is what mitochondria look like in general. So here's your cell again, and you'll see inside eukaryote cells these kind of beam-like structures. Those are mitochondria. So one of these is called a mitochondrion, but many of them are called mitochondria. So this mitochondrion looks like this. And you know how in the previous slide we talked about how they have an outer membrane and inner membrane, right? So here's that outer membrane right here, so the outside of that mitochondrion. And inside, this wiggly stuff, is that inner membrane. This double membrane structure that they have is important once we get into cell respiration. You need to remember that it has these two membranes and has spaces between them, because those spaces between the cell those mitochondrial membranes are important for cell respiration. So these are the organelles that will be generating the energy that your cells need to do their job. You get your energy though from what specifically? Food. For food, right? So you eat food, your cells then break the food down using cell respiration, and that then gets your energy. Okay? But do all organisms need to eat? No. Who doesn't need to eat?
Plants.
Plants, right? So why don't plants need to eat?
Photosynthesis?
They can do, and what does that do?
Convert sunlight to energy.
Close. More specifically, it does what?
Chemical energy?
More specifically than
Converts
that.
sunlight into ATP.
Not quite. So they don't have to eat food. They can make it. That's right. So mitochondria, though, before I get to that, though, I want to mention one thing about mitochondria that's actually kind of cool. Mitochondria have their own DNA. So your cells have DNA, right? And where do your cells carry their DNA? The nucleus. But there's DNA elsewhere as well inside your cells. Because your mitochondria have their own DNA. That's kind of weird. Why do they have their own DNA? Besides that, at least in humans, that DNA, the DNA in your mitochondria, only came from our mothers. So the DNA of your mitochondria only came from your mom. Your dad did not contribute to that DNA in any way. Kind of weird.
Is it because the mitochondria are very ancient, like organelle that for us and only that's why they have their own DNA?
You'll find out.
Okay.
Yeah, at the very end, you'll find out. But it's pretty cool though, right? You have the mitochondria themselves have their own DNA separate from the DNA of your cells, and their DNA only came from your mom.
That specific DNA to them is the one that's only from the mom? Or all of the DNA?
No. So the DNA inside your nucleus of your cells, they came from both your mom and your dad. But a DNA that's only in the mitochondria only came from your mom.
Okay.
So the reason I bring up this fun fact for a reason, you're going to find out why at the end of the lecture. But like we had already established though, not all organisms need to eat. A lot of organisms, like plants, can make their own food, which is great. Because they don't have to go in and out and make that stupid ass line and just get a double-double. You can make your own double-doubles. But the reason they can do that, the reason why plants can actually make their own food is because they have organelles called chloroplasts.
Now, these chloroplasts, they're kind of like solar panels. They're able to take the energy of the sun and make food out of it. That process that they do in order to turn solar energy into food is called photosynthesis. Photo means light. Synthesis means to make something. So they're using light to make food. And it happens in these organelles called chloroplasts. Now what's interesting is that plants, they can make food, right? And they make food with their chloroplasts. But is that it? Are they done? Do you still need to break down that food?
Like molecules or something like that?
They still need to break down that food, right? Because you have to break down the food you eat. So plants, they make food with chloroplasts, but they still have to break down that food. So plants don't just have chloroplasts. They also have mitochondria too. Because the chloroplasts only make food. The plants still need the mitochondria to break down that food in order to get the energy out of it. Now, chloroplasts are pretty cool in their own ways, though, because just like the mitochondria, they have their own DNA. Kind of weird. They also have a very similar structure to mitochondria. They have a bunch of folds inside. They have two membranes, just like the mitochondria have. But there's one thing that makes chloroplasts different from mitochondria. It's this stuff right here, chlorophyll. You guys know what chlorophyll is?
The pigment?
It's a pigment, right? And why is it important? To allow you something to do.
They
Absorbs.
absorb the light into energy.
Exactly. This chlorophyll is a pigment, so it's a molecule that you find inside chloroplasts. And it has the ability to take the energy of the sun and turn it into energy that can be used to make food. You really can't do photosynthesis unless you have this pigment. You guys know what color that pigment is?
Green.
Green, yeah! That's where plants get their green color, from this pigment that they have inside the chloroplast. So here's a chloroplast. So here's a plant cell. They have their nucleus, so of course they're eukaryote. They also have mitochondria, right? Because they need to break down their food. But they'll also have these green organelles called chloroplasts. So here's a chloroplast right here. And if you notice it, there's actually some similarities between this chloroplast and the mitochondria you saw earlier, right? Roughly bean shape. It has two membranes, and it has a bunch of folds in it. There's a reason why there's have similarities. And we're going to talk about why when we talk about photosynthesis. Just remember the chloroplasts have some structural similarities to mitochondria, but the big difference is that color. What color is that? Green, right? And why is it green? The chlorophyll, exactly. The chlorophyll that is in the chloroplast is what is important here. That green pigment is what allows chloroplasts and ultimately plants the ability to take the energy of the sun and make food with it. So this is what chloroplasts will do. And remember, plants have to have both these guys. Because for chloroplasts, they're only good for making food. But that's it. The plant still needs to be able to break down the food to get the energy out of that food. And so, after chloroplast has taken energy from the sun and put it into food, the plant still needs its mitochondria to break that food down to get the energy out of it. Does that make sense? So you and I, because we actually have to eat our food, we only have mitochondria. None of us are green, right? I hope not. But plants, they have one better on us. They can make their own food. But they still have to break that food down just like we do. Does that make sense? So any questions about chloroplasts and mitochondria? Alright, so I did mention that chloroplasts and mitochondria both have their own DNA, right? DNA that's separate from the DNA of their cells. So that's been a kind of a weird mystery for a long, long time. A lot of scientists saw that and were like, what the hell is that all about? Why do these organelles have their own DNA? But then we started looking at making other observations about chloroplasts and mitochondria, and we realized something. There's something weird about chloroplasts and mitochondria compared to all the other organelles in the body. And that eventually led us to realize chloroplasts and mitochondria came from somewhere. They came from somewhere outside of your cells.
What if you could absorb another organism and take on its abilities? Imagine you swallowed a small bird and suddenly gained the ability to fly. Or if you engulfed a cobra and were then able to spit poisonous venom from your teeth. Throughout the history of life, specifically during the evolution of complex eukaryotic cells, things like this happened all the time. One organism absorbed another, and they united to become a new organism with the combined abilities of both. We think that around 2 billion years ago, the only living organisms on Earth were prokaryotes, single-celled organisms lacking membrane-bound organelles. Let's look closely at just 3 of them. One was a big, simple, blob-like cell with the ability to absorb things by wrapping its cell membrane around them. Another was a bacterial cell that converted solar energy into sugar molecules through photosynthesis. A third used oxygen gas to break down materials like sugar and release its energy into a form useful for life activities. The blob cells would occasionally absorb the little photosynthetic bacteria. These bacteria then lived inside the blob and divided like they always had, but their existence became linked. If you stumbled upon this living arrangement, you might just think that the whole thing was one organism, that the green photosynthetic bacteria were just a part of the blob that performed one of its life functions, just like your heart is a part of you that performs the function of pumping your blood. This process of cells living together is called endosymbiosis, one organism living inside another. But the endosymbiosis didn't stop there. What would happen if the other bacteria moved in too? Now the cells of this species started becoming highly complex. They were big and full of intricate structures that we call chloroplasts and mitochondria. These structures worked together to harness sunlight, make sugar, and break down that sugar using the oxygen that right around this time started to appear in the Earth's atmosphere. Organisms absorbing other organisms was one way species adapted to the changing environmental conditions of their surroundings. This little story highlights what biologists call the endosymbiotic theory, the current best explanation of how complex cells evolved. There's a lot of evidence that supports this theory, but let's look at 3 main pieces. First, the chloroplasts and mitochondria in our cells multiply the very same way as those ancient bacteria, which are still around, by the way. In fact, if you destroy these structures in a cell, no new ones will appear. The cell can't make them. They can only make more of themselves. Second piece of evidence. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both contain their own DNA and ribosomes. Their DNA has a circular structure that is strikingly similar to the DNA of the ancient bacteria, and it also contains many similar genes. So ribosomes, or protein assembly machines of chloroplasts and mitochondria, also have the same structure as ribosomes of ancient bacteria, but are different from the ribosomes hanging around the rest of the eukaryotic cell. Lastly, think about the membranes involved in the engulfing process. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both have 2 membranes surrounding them, an inner and outer membrane. Their inner membrane contains some particular lipids and proteins that are not present in the outer membrane. Why is that significant? Because their outer membrane used to belong to the blob cell. When they were engulfed in the endosymbiosis process, they got wrapped up in that membrane and kept their own as their inner one. Surely enough, those same lipids and proteins are found on the membranes of the ancient bacteria. Biologists now use this theory to explain the origin of the vast variety of eukaryotic organisms. Take the green algae that grow on the walls of swimming pools. A larger eukaryotic cell with spinning tail structures, or flagella, at some point absorbed algae like these to form what we now call euglena. Euglena can perform photosynthesis, break down sugar using oxygen, and swim around pond water. And as the theory would predict, the chloroplasts in these euglena have 3 membranes, since they had 2 before being engulfed. The absorbing process of endosymbiotic theory allowed organisms to combine powerful abilities to become better adapted to life on Earth. The results were species capable of much more than when they were separate organisms. And this was an evolutionary leap that led to the microorganisms, plants, and animals we observe on the planet today.
So basically, mitochondria and chloroplasts are tiny organisms that live inside of you. Basically what they're saying. But even though they are these tiny organisms living inside you, they're extremely important. Because without them, you would not be able to survive as you are now. So any questions about what we talked about today? All right, guys. I'll see you guys next week.